the First Peoples Radio presents Amplifying Voices, a project which aims to preserve, promote, and revitalize Indigenous languages and cultures. Cameron Adams is Ininiw-Anishinaabe and French-Canadian with Scottish and English ancestry from Gimli, Manitoba, and Treaty from Berens River, situated in Treaty 5 territory. Indigenous languages have come a long way, with a cultural renaissance of media and materials. Cameron feels there are some ways to help it go even further.
Danse, kitatam skatinawaw, gagano kinawaw, Cameron Adams netisinekasan, Igwa uta Gimli kapian megots, su Scots nimeninitain ewapa mittago ki tom, anochkagi sagak. Hello all, my name is Cameron Adams. It's nice to be here in Gimli today with you, and it's nice to see you all again. Today I'm going to be talking about Indigenous languages and their use in contemporary society. Specifically, in recent decades, since about probably 1990, Indigenous languages have been utilized in different mediums across Canada that demonstrate how they can be used in modern day, but also how they are viable and able to still be preserved and passed down by speakers. For instance, in the late 1990s, the Aboriginal People's Television Network in Canada was created, which brought Indigenous voices through a national broadcaster, which included many Indigenous languages in different capacities. And this demonstrates kind of like, working together in the Indigenous community, in English, French, but also different Indigenous languages, and how the hope by, such a broadcaster was that this would provide Indigenous languages and Indigenous voices with modern day opportunities within the telecom industry. But apart from that organization, there's also different organizations and different initiatives that have brought Indigenous languages. For instance, in different Olympics, they've had Indigenous language interpretation and translation brought to different Indigenous languages, such as Cree, Inuktitut, Ojibwe, and others. Those languages, are some of the more spoken Indigenous languages in Canada. However, smaller Indigenous languages at different points are also supported in different capacities, such as different Michif languages, Northern Michif, Southern Michif, even French Michif, in different opportunities, such as like for translations of different events. Most recently, one of the events a few years, probably 5 years ago, was the Pope's Apology. And the Pope's Apology for Indian residential schools in Canada had over a dozen Indigenous languages have simultaneous interpretation for the apology across Canada. This was a really cool initiative that I was able to observe as a university student, kind of seeing in these languages at a very high level federally by speakers. But I also think that this demonstrates something more broadly known as normalization of a language and the usage, and how these languages are also viable today, but as we hope that they will be viable in years to come when we build capacity. Critical capacity in Indigenous languages, takes work, but it also takes support from institutions, different levels of government, different organizations, and people working together. For me and my work, this means, if you're working on something, it might include recording, transcribing, transcription. It might be developing specific vocabulary for different domains of usage. For instance, like I mentioned earlier, at the Olympics, right? Certain vocabulary in Cree, for instance, and there I'm talking about Plains Cree, I don't want to be general, was actually coined, right, to support translation, and so that there was accurate terms. Because our languages maybe haven't seen some of these domains in a regular capacity, it does involve some prep work that maybe other languages like English and French do not need currently because they already have capacity and domains of usage in these spaces. But what it to me it shows is a sign of hope, but also optimism for a future and a present that really includes diverse language use across Canada. I've also seen in different areas Indigenous languages available for interpretation and translation through different service providers. But I think what this is doing, it's providing a service, but it's also encouraging for people to know that as like an organization that they're able to offer these services. So if you want to approach maybe different audiences, if you want to be there in different events or different communities, that having access to Indigenous language interpretation and translation can help you reach communities at different levels, but also encourage the use and normalization of these languages. I think one of the things that I find most interesting, though, is accessing new domains in Indigenous languages. And that's something I really want to talk about right now. In recent years, as a learner of Swampy Cree, otherwise known as Ininiw-Anishinaabe or Nanawewan, I've seen Indigenous languages try to kind of push boundaries on where they're spoken. But in my own learning journey, I've really tried to learn vocabulary relevant to my life, which has included, wondering how to order like my Tim Hortons double double in Cree, wondering what I can do, if I'm, at a pharmacy, how can I order my prescription, or just examples like that. But what this is I'm trying to understand how I can use my language in different spaces that maybe we don't have guaranteed vocabulary for, or there's not known vocabulary in my language lexicons and grammars. This is important, right? Because if I'm really truly going to learn my language, it has to be from a perspective of accessibility, but also understanding that language must happen everywhere and anywhere. And I think that that's one of my hopes for a better future in language revitalization, but also speaking Kitay Muin Awa, Tapskuts in the Nimuin and Anishinaabe Muin Limit Kagano Kitay Muin Noa, Enu Te Petamak, Kagano Uhe, Nipimatisu Anek, Sus Scots, Niminos Kaga ni Petaman, Nitayumuin, is speak ka motea tapos ko swanawita me ka gisagak. Tapos e mamaskata man is speak ka nisitota man kegwan. So like I'm really grateful when I hear my language, if I'm outside, if I'm walking, and when I understand it. I think that for me is like a little bit of pride that I have is when I hear it, but also like just to know that it's spoken. And I think that, I'm emphasizing spoken because I've talked a little bit about writing my language and, the importance of literacy. However, writing my language is my second priority. The reason I write my language is to preserve my understanding and comprehension of the literacy, and because most resources that are standardized, they help me as a second language learner. However, to me, it's of utmost importance that we do learn how to speak our languages from first language speakers. Just like English and French, right? We always look to Anglophones and Francophones when we want to learn those languages properly, right? Despite the diversity of dialects or kind of the way in which people sound, there's still language and there's still ways to comprehend one another. Whereas in my own Indigenous language, there's limited people on an average day that I do speak with in this language. But my hope and what I've seen is that there are more people that are learning this language. There are more people that are starting to use it. And what this over time will show is that there is hope. There's promises, there's promising, kind of realities happening. But there's also like a better future, hopefully, on the horizon that includes Indigenous languages in more domains than even today, right? And sometimes that means doing uncomfortable things, such as like offering an Indigenous language course or something, even if there's not 10 people, which is maybe a requirement for a university. Yeah. But basically, I think that we really need to ensure that we're pushing boundaries and domains of Indigenous languages. For instance, like I talked about at the start of this episode, Indigenous languages in different media is very important. Recently, APTN launched an Indigenous language broadcast so that you can listen to Indigenous languages on television at any moment during the day in I think over a dozen Indigenous languages. This is normalizing and putting together all these resources in one so that if someone wants to hear any Indigenous language that they offer, they can, and it's a one-stop shop. For me, this is important. Another recent thing that happened was that Star Wars has now been translated and carried out in Anishinaabe, which is otherwise known as Ojibwe. This is really cool. I have friends that were actually part of this, and I think it's commendable because it enters into a new domain, but it also brings hope to families who want to show their children a classic Star Wars film, but in an Indigenous language. So what it does is it brings together our culture, our language, but also something contemporary like Star Wars. So I think it's really cool, and I'm hoping that Star Wars is just the start of many different acts of language revitalization and reclamation that incorporate our languages into the best films of our time so that we can see ourselves, because representation, even including in language reclamation, is extremely important. But it's also the normalization of our languages. That doesn't mean if we want to watch Star Wars or any other film that we always have to do it in an English or French or, a lingua franca of some sort. It shows that even if it's a small production, our language is valuable and we can enter those spaces too. I think that there's also different avenues of hope in Indigenous language revitalization that, personally I would like to see. For instance, if, I could watch CFL football in Swampy Cree, I think that would be an excellent opportunity of utilizing vocabulary, but also a sport that I actively watch. That also includes curling and kind of understanding how our worldviews interact with these sports. Um, for me, I've watched NHL hockey in Plains Cree, but I've listened once to uh, Plains Cree for CFL football. I've listened to a match, and for me, that was really cool to kind of hear our language in those spaces. But I think that regular opportunities for this is particularly beneficial so that folks who are learning their language can learn the vocabulary. But in order to support it, I think that the development of resources, so lexicons that describe the language that will be used, like a playbook almost of what the language is, like if he tackles him or if they throw the ball, right? Like how do you say all that in Swampy Cree, for instance? And to show what that is and kind of whenever there's new vocabulary to really include it, because this will help people gain an understanding and kind of a grammatical base and a language base within the vocabulary so that they can really understand when at regular speed this language is being spoken. I think that this would support learners of the language, but also fluent speakers who might find that the language vocabulary isn't what they understand, but so that they could follow along. But I also think that different sports and different maybe non-traditional activities, I think that having opportunities for them in Indigenous languages is also important, right? It's not necessarily about the demand, it's about reaching people, right? And if the more you have, the merrier. But it also shows that we can, there's no boundaries to our language, and this might provide hope and show that really anything's possible, right? Maybe 20, 30 years ago, they would have said that an Indigenous language film was kind of far-fetched. Why would you do that, right? However, today we know that this is popular, right? And tomorrow we might have Indigenous language baseball Or, in 10 years, we might have, Indigenous language being, spoken in a public event, right? And you'd have interpretation in your ears. But I really think that, when I conclude here, that all these opportunities normalize and decenter the role of dominant languages like lingua francas in it, like English and French. So, Ksusquats Kiranasko Mittanao, Gape Totea Kanochkagi Sagak. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you all for listening. I appreciate the time, and I hope you enjoyed listening.
Amplifying Voices was developed in collaboration with over 60 Indigenous language keepers, experts, broadcasters, and academics, and is guided by an Indigenous advisory group comprising broadcasters, language experts, elders, and authors. The project is produced by Multicultural and the First Peoples Radio, and funded through the Radio Fund of Canada.